I've said the word a dozen times. I probably said it a dozen times in the first seminar if you were on it with the programming series. But really, what is a strategic framework? It's a vision, a plan, an ideal for where you want to go and how you plan to get there. It also helps create the pathway by showing you key components and how they build on each other, really how they become such an important part of the overall end result that's embedded within your operational practices. These are the framework components. And so although we follow the framework in a general order, we will combine certain ones you can see in certain seminars and separate out others where they maybe need more time. And because Mia will be discussing the data and evaluation series in more detail, I'm just briefly going to go through the components of the framework so you can understand what they are and kind of how they build on each other. I've done this before. You might have heard this before, but I think it's so important to think about this in the context of everything you're doing. We have a number of people in different positions on these seminars. And so thinking about where you fit in and where you can ultimately look at maybe just a piece of improving practices in your area is really important. So kind of think about that as we go through this. So the first is program inventory and literature review. What do you have, and is it truly evidence-based and effective? These are not the same thing, and they're both equally important. The program inventory really focuses on building a capacity in terms of what do you have, and the literature review really helps start getting you those answers. This creates a cross-agency list of programs with specific descriptions, budget information that really matches to the evidence and literature that exists. The first part of our programming series was developing an inventory and is available on our website if you're interested. And we'll be covering in the December one, which we'll talk about in more detail later, ultimately the program, really looking at the evidence based behind those program inventories. The second piece of the framework is logic models and process maps. So how do we know what to expect from our programs? Do we have missing pieces? Logic models and process maps really help outline the theory of change for a program. Really answering what are we asking, what are the results, and how is the data going to be collected? How are we going to know what we're doing? The third piece of the strategic framework is contracting practices. Now that you've developed a program and understand what to expect and what we're aiming to achieve, how do we relay that into words? This really practices on engaging providers with data to meet the client needs, target outcomes of budgeting, and strengthen accountability and fidelity monitoring in order to achieve those estimated or intended results. I'm going to take a second and just soak in that first part here. You have to become educated on your programs, understand how to build them, make sure that you're outlining what to expect and what to be achieved, and then put all of that into a contract that includes monitoring that is really kind of research-based in how you look at accountability and fidelity so you can actually achieve the outcomes that you have intended. Many of you know and are probably working on this, but considering you put all this together and then you have low fidelity in a contract in terms of how it's being operationalized, it might actually produce higher recidivism than just not doing anything at all. So all of these steps really flow together well to kind of build that structure in your county. The fourth component of the strategic framework is data strategy and dashboards. You're in it, you're here. So this is really about improving monitoring populations, programs, and outcomes across systems. Creating data dashboard views for a variety of audiences, from your local day-to-day operations to really focusing on transparency details for the public. So really everything, and that's what we hope to engage with you today. Finally, program evaluation and cost benefit analysis as the final piece of the framework. This gives you a set of expectations when taken nationally or locally. And does it actually work? What is the cost benefit of the program you're implementing? Can it be used to guide development and changes in programs? And then really on the program evaluation side, proving that what you're doing is working. I think it goes back to that statement I said at first, which is a narrative is not enough. Hearing people say, people like this, they think it's working is wonderful, but really focusing on proving that is the really critical piece of this end. So no matter where you started in the framework or what you've done to date, there's always places to engage and keep up improving practices. That's the great thing about this. It can be done concurrently. It can be done individually. We're here to help you, support you through that, and really focus on that. So I have gone way over my time. And so I'm going to toss it over to Mia, who will be guiding you through kind of more how the data and evaluation series will go on and then jumping into the series. So Mia, feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Ryan. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know a lot of us were up late last night and we're probably feeling a little bit distracted today with the layers upon layers of everything that we're dealing with. So I appreciate you being here. I know going into a data and evaluation seminar series the morning after a late night election probably feels like a lot. And so we're going to do our best today to keep this fairly high level and to walk you through it in a way that both we hope you can absorb today, but also to give you some materials so that you can follow up later and sort of refresh on the content. And as Ryan said, we're also available between the seminar meetings for technical assistance to help you to implement some of these components. So we're really excited to be here with you today. I'm going to take the lead on most of the presenting. Mike and Kevin are going to jump in a bit to give you some examples of county experience, and then Ryan's going to wrap up for us today. And so today we're working on the first part of what we're thinking of as our data strategy. And that first part is really focusing on how can you get the data that you need from your agency system to get it out of your agency system, to use it to make decisions within your agency. And for those of you that are interested in linking with other agencies within your county, how can you do that? So that's sort of the first part of our data strategy, is really thinking about how do we bring together data at the county level to start to build a data infrastructure. And I know many of you are already engaged in that work. Some of you may be very new to that work. And so the way that we're presenting this series is really imagining that you have little experience working with building a data infrastructure. So we're kind of starting from square one. And hopefully bringing you through that process with us for those of you who don't have a lot of experience. But we also hope that it'll be value for those who are in the process now and who are engaged with that work, particularly through the technical assistance we want to provide to support you. And so the way we've broken this down is, first, we're going to think about county data. How do we assemble that data? And then for those of you who are interested in bringing in state data, and particularly DOJ and CDCR data, how do we request that data? How do we submit a request? What data elements do we ask for? How do we go through the process of bringing in data that the state holds for our population within an agency or within a county? And that will be sort of our second meeting in January. Following that, the last piece of our data strategy is then, once you get that state data, how do you integrate it with your county data? And when you have that data strategy complete, you've kind of moved through all these different components that allow you to build a data infrastructure that really creates a vision of people as they're moving through systems. So it brings together all the information that we really need to have about individuals to understand how they're doing and what's working for them. And so that's what we have in mind when we've broken this data strategy up. So that's what we have on our agenda for our first 3 sessions of the series. And then when we get to the last 2 sessions, we're starting to then tap into that data infrastructure to use it to create tools that are actually informative for decision making. So we're going to cover visualizing your data in the 4th session. And then finally, how do you do outcomes evaluation once you have all this data assembled? How do you determine which programs are effective and for whom? We're going to be pausing along the way for questions, but as Ryan said, if you do have a question, please feel free to jump in the chat or raise your hand. So as I said, we're going to make this, very introductory. I remember my first year of graduate school coming into the public policy program at UC Berkeley and having a question on my mind. And that question was, what is data? I really don't have a good idea of that. I was a 23-year-old who hadn't really worked with data before. And I knew data was key to improving public policy, but I didn't really know what that was. And so throughout this seminar, we're going to kind of be filling out the answer to that question. What is data? And also, how do you use it? And when I think of what is data, I really think of data is information, right? It's just the information that we need. We need to access it and we need to bring it into a form that we can actually use it. And so when we think about data, we think about quantifiable data that's sort of represented with numbers, data that's in a digital form. But we also have a lot of data in our systems that may not already be in that form. It may be in PDFs, it may be a hard copy, it may actually be in the experience of individuals working within your system. And so when we're thinking about data, we want to kind of use that broad conception. We don't want to start out with just what do we have in sort of a spreadsheet form, but we want to think about what information is in our system that we need to bring together and probably create it to a digital form in order to utilize, really what's in our system that we need to know. What's the key information? Next slide, Ryan. And so when you're thinking about participating in the seminar, you're probably thinking, is this a seminar for data analysts? Is this a seminar for researchers? Who is this seminar for? And when we think about working toward evidence-based data-driven practice, we really think about this as an operation that requires a team. We need a team that includes leadership, because leadership is ultimately making those policy and practice decisions. And those decisions are affecting both operations and programming. And in the process, as operations and programming folks are delivering the content of your agency, they're sort of also creating the information that you really need. So they're entering in the data, or they're tracking information, or they're gaining experiential knowledge of your population and outcomes. That's all extremely valuable to then bring to the research and analyst team within your agency and within your county. And the role of those folks is really to bring together that information, to turn it into data, and then to figure out how we can use that data, how we can visualize it, how we can analyze it to inform leadership, to inform those policy and practice decisions. So we're kind of thinking about this as a very generalizable step path to success, where we start with a vision, we have a set of goals, and then we implement a strategy. We develop the strategy, we take a set of action steps to implement it, and it brings us to something we call success. And what we're thinking of success in this case is really informing policy and practice with data and evidence. Next slide. And so when we're putting together this seminar series, we're thinking, what's the vision that we're designing this series around? What is it that we are broadly trying to achieve? And it's just that. It's this vision that we can better leverage data and evidence to improve public safety and to reduce recidivism. And that vision leads us to a set of goals that we can implement in the short term. And it involves thinking about policy and practice at the agency level, so making improvements there, thinking about policy and practice at the county level and making improvements there. And then lastly, really being able to demonstrate that success. So thinking about what are the tools that we need to show what's working well. So that vision and these goals orient sort of the strategy that we've built for this seminar series. And what we're doing with you, again, is we're starting with the building of data infrastructure, right? We're building it within your agency first, then we're building it within the county by linking data across agencies, and then linking with the state. So really building that data infrastructure is the first piece of that strategy and will comprise the first 3 seminar meetings. And then we're thinking, how can we then, once we have that infrastructure assembled, how can we then begin to visualize that data to really draw insights from that data about how population characteristics are changing, how programs are being implemented, who is getting programming, who is not getting programming, and what do their outcomes look like? So just beginning to descriptively visualize the data. And then moving into analysis, right? So how can we then draw some conclusions, not descriptive conclusions, but really causal conclusions about the effects of different interventions on the outcomes that we most care about. And those conclusions are what we can then use to inform policy and practice, as well as to demonstrate success. So we've kind of walked you through the vision, the goals, and the strategy that we have in mind for this seminar. Okay, so here's what you're in for about the next 45 minutes or so. What we're gonna do is to spend the rest of this seminar focusing on some steps that we can take, 5 steps to be exact, to really build that county data infrastructure. And as we go, you're gonna kind of be thinking, do we want to take this step? Are these all steps we want to take, or do we want to, and the key question really is, do we want to focus on just our agency data infrastructure, or do we want to build more of a county-wide or at least multi-agency data infrastructure? So that's a big question for you to have in your mind as we're moving through this seminar. After the seminar, you'll receive we'll be providing some supporting materials, and those materials are really to help support your efforts either at the agency level or at the county level in creating that data infrastructure. And then, as we said, we are absolutely available and very interested in working with you to provide that technical assistance. The kind of work we're talking about today is difficult. It takes a lot of effort and focus, and it requires sort of putting some key pieces into place. But it's also work that we've all done with counties before, and we're really excited to do with you. So please tap us for technical assistance for the components that you want to realize. So as I said, we're going to walk through the structure of the rest of the presentation is just walking through these 5 steps. We're going to start with identifying the key questions. You know, when we say data-driven and evidence-based practice, what we mean is really how do we bring data and evidence to bear on the things that matter to us, the things that we really need to answer in order to make what we feel is good practice and good policy decisions. And so that's why we really start with the questions. We let those lead us. And in this presentation, we're going to give you some examples of questions that might motivate this kind of work. But of course, identifying those questions is really something for you to do within your agency and within your county. And so based on what those questions are, then you're going to turn to data sources and you're going to ask, you know, in order to answer these questions well, what are the data sources that are really required? And this is really helpful in thinking about, are you aiming at working within your agency right now, or do you really need to think about working across your county and also with state data? So that's really determined, which data sources you need are really determined by the questions you have. And then within those data sources, what are the key data elements? And today we're really going to focus on just county agency data sources, and in particular, jail and probation data as a model. And then once you've identified the questions, the sources you need to tap, and the elements, the key pieces of information that you need within those sources, what is your plan for extracting data within an agency? And then if you need to, what is your plan for linking data across agencies? So to start with, we're kind of going to take you through a little bit of a process of identifying key questions. Even if your role isn't to ever touch data, you know, in your role, what kind of information do you need? And where could you get that information? And do you have the information that you need to do your job well? Those are the kinds of questions we're thinking about as we're developing those key questions that we want to ask of our data. Next slide, please, Ryan. So what we're doing here, and Ryan, you're going to have to scroll through these. Sorry about that. Sorry, everyone, we mentioned some technical difficulties this morning. You can go ahead and scroll through the slide, Ryan. So what we're thinking here are, what are the key population characteristics of our client population? So that may be probationers, that may be folks that are moving through the jail system, that may be folks moving through the court system. From the state's perspective, that may be individuals coming to CDCR. And so we're thinking about, you know, what is our core population and what do we need to know about that population? This is a huge set of motivating questions that often leads us to tap into data. And over the past decade or so, we've seen so much change coming from the state level in particular that's really affected the characteristics of local populations. And so that's a key driver in terms of our quest for information. What's happening to our population over time? How is it changing as a result of these different changes in criminal justice policy? And then another key question that often jumps out is, what are the criminal history characteristics of this population? And this can sometimes be a big motivator for bringing in state DOJ and CDCR data so that we can really see that statewide criminal history and the prison history of individuals that are in our county. And that really helps from a research perspective because it's difficult to pull that data for a large number of people. And so being able to bring that data in from the state allows us to be much more efficient in understanding the characteristics of the population. Next slide. And so we often also ask questions, you know, about the characteristics of people that are participating in programs, you know, who is getting programs? And are they the right programs? Those are some of the questions that we typically bring to data. And how are those programs aligning with risks and needs? And so part of, as Ryan said, one of the reasons that we put that program inventory so early in the strategic framework is that we really need to know what kinds of programs we have operating for the population that we're working with in order to then think about, do we have the right data for those programs? Are we able to track people's participation? Are we able to capture that data? And this is one of the trickiest areas of data because there's so many different program providers. Some may be within your agency, some may be contracted by your agency, some may just be community-based providers. And so really deciding what are the key programs that you want to identify, what are the questions you have about those programs, and how do we bring together the data that you need to answer those questions? This is a big piece of our quest. Next slide. And then finally, recidivism outcomes. These are certainly not the only outcomes of interest. There's lots of things we're interested in terms of these populations, but it is a key driver to the work that we're doing. So what are the recidivism outcomes of our population? How are they varying across groups? How are they changing over time? Are the programs that we have and the other interventions we're thinking about using, are they reducing recidivism? Which of the programs we have are the most effective? So these are huge drivers in all of the work that we're doing to be able to get to a point where we can understand recidivism outcomes. And I want to pause here for a moment because one thing that is so important is to understand that we can't just compare recidivism outcomes across counties, for example, because we know that different counties have such different populations with very different characteristics. And that's one of the key reasons we really want to build out this data infrastructure so that when we're analyzing changes in recidivism outcomes over time or differences across populations or differences across counties, when we're doing that work, that kind of comparative work, we really want to adjust for those differences in population characteristics. That's really important in terms of comparing apples to apples. So what I've just laid out, population characteristics, programmatic interventions, and recidivism outcomes, these are really just sort of a set of questions that we commonly bring to data. And they're meant just to kind of pique your interest and inspire your thinking as you as an agency or you as a county come together to identify sort of what the key questions are for you. So these are certainly not the only questions you might ask or the most important ones necessarily, but just some questions to get you thinking in this process. And I'd love to turn it over to Mike now to talk a little bit about some work on recidivism outcomes that he did with Yolo County.
Great, thank you, Mia. And I know many of you, as I'm scrolling through the names and looking at some of the faces, many of you I know and recognize, and I've done this work with. So I think I could have picked from a number of different counties. We've done this in Tulare County and Kern County and some others where we've been able to look at long-term recidivism rates and really help the county shape what they're doing in terms of looking at recidivism. But the one I did want to pull out is some fantastic work that was done in Yolo County over the last probably year and a half or so. And a couple of things that really stood out in the Yolo County work is first, and I'm hopefully I don't steal some of your slides later on, Mia, but a lot of what you're going to hear Mia talk about down the road, Yolo did a wonderful job of this. They started off by engaging people across the spectrum, and it was nice to see on the poll that we had both leadership and analysts and programmatic people. We had a good mix of individuals, and Yolo County really did a good job with that. They first had buy-in from the highest level of leadership, both in probation, in the sheriff's office, in the district attorney's office, and then they created, after they had that high level leadership buy-in, they created a cross-agency work group. And that work group consisted of analysts from the DA's office, from probation, from the sheriff's office, from IT. And in doing that, they were able to talk through what exactly did they want to accomplish. What did they want to accomplish, not just as an agency, but what do they want to accomplish as a county in terms of looking at recidivism? And then how could they combine data across these multiple systems? How could the probation data talk to the DA data? How could that then talk to the sheriff's data so that they could look not only at people returning to probation or returning to jail, but looking at how people interact and move across the whole system. So when we have these discussions with the work group, we were, again, fortunate to have leadership, IT, and analytical staff, and then we had some help. In this case, it was from me, from the CSAC consultants, we had help to walk through that process. And during that process, we said, what's most important for you to know about your recidivism data? And they originally, Yolo County originally wanted to look at this to do cost-benefit analysis, but in these discussions, they said, well, we want to be able to do more than just cost-benefit analysis. We want to be able to talk about recidivism over a long period of time. They wanted to look at 6 years, so we looked at recidivism over a 6-year period. And they wanted to look at it in multiple ways. So they were particularly interested in looking at new bookings, new charges, and new convictions, both with and without technical violations. So at first that sounded very complex, but once we talked through as a group and we realized where the data, what data were available with each agency, how we could join these data, they were able to pull that data in a way that allowed them to measure recidivism in all these various ways. The other piece I wanted to add in here is a little bit of a plug for the work we're doing here with CSAC and doing with you in the counties, is we developed a recidivism tool that has helped many of you and helped Yolo County, and hopefully in the future we'll continue to work with the new counties to do this, but a recidivism tool, really a calculator, to take that data that they work together to put together and then produce a consistent measurement of recidivism that could be used across time within that county, so that they would be doing an apples-to-apples comparison if they looked at this over time. So finally, all of that analysis that was done was part of a report they did in Yolo County. It allowed them to estimate the potential impact of programs that were designed to reduce recidivism, including the cost-benefit analysis that they originally wanted to look at, as well as it allowed the county to then have a tool that they can update their recidivism analysis on a regular basis and do this work moving forward. So as Mia said, really that building capacity so that the county, in this case Yolo County, could continue doing this work moving forward because they had a tool, they had a work group in place, and they now had a roadmap for doing this work moving forward. So that's an example of Yolo. I know there's some others. I've done this work in other counties as well, but I wanted to highlight that one today and then turn it back to you, Mia.
Thank you, Mike. Do we have any questions from the group? I saw one.
Kevin, I'm going to read from the chat, actually. Francisco Pardes asked, what definition of recidivism is CSAC using within California? That's probably for Mike or Mia.
Sure.
Sure.
Go ahead, Mike.
Go for it, Mia. Go ahead, Mia.
No, please.
Well, so there's a couple pieces that we've done with our work with CSAC. Is one, we have a cost-benefit model that we use, and the recidivism definition that's used for the cost-benefit model is a felony conviction over the follow-up time period that we're looking at. So that's not a CSAC definition, but that's a definition for the way the math of the model works, because we're looking at programmatic outcomes, which often measure their outcome as reductions in recidivism. So that's what we typically use. And as you've seen the Yolo County example, they said, well, that's fine for our cost-benefit model, but we want to look at it multiple ways for our county. So we've worked with counties to look at this many different ways and have it use just one definition when we've been doing this work with CSAC. But I interrupted you, Mia, if you want to add to that.
No, I think that was a great answer. And we've got another question, it looks like.
Yeah, there's a question from Sarah. How are you looking at programmatic outcomes and what kind of program data is matched?
Sure, I can take that one, at least what we did for Yolo County, and then Mia, feel free to follow up on that. So in Yolo County, we weren't able to dive into actual outcome evaluations within the county, so we relied on the meta-analysis, which you'll hear more about in the other set of our seminar series. But we relied on the research base that's out there that said, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy programs on average reduce recidivism by 12%. So we used the literature base to then apply that to recidivism reductions. One of our long-term goals is, and part of this data infrastructure, is to be able to help counties to be able to do their own evaluation so that we can look at outcomes like rearrest, reconviction, and then be able to look at the long-term impacts of those programs on recidivism.
Yeah, that's great. And I would just add, a little plug for that second component of the framework, looking at the logic models for your program. So there's not really one answer to what outcomes we would look at, because you can think about programs having different purposes. And often we think of recidivism as a long-term outcome that we're interested in within the criminal justice system. But there might be intermediary outcomes. For example, if you have an education program or an employment program, one of those intermediate outcomes might be that people complete an educational sequence or that they find a job. And we might have theory that that has those achieving those intermediary outcomes, which we'd see in your logic model, that those intermediary outcomes are important in affecting recidivism outcomes. And so we can imagine looking at both. And the nice thing about the intermediary outcomes is you can look at them in the short term, right? So you can have some indication in the short term of programmatic success. So that's why it's so important. Kind of the logic model is really a theory of your program and how it's meant to achieve change. And so it will depend sort of on what that program looks like. And I think actually,
one more. Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, Kevin, we're going to go to your conversation about technical violations in a little bit. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, I was going to hold this one maybe for the next call. Yeah. So Richard, we'll get to your question maybe in a few minutes, but that's a good one as well.
Definitely. Thank you for the questions. So Ryan, could you move on to the next slide? Okay, so we're on step 2 of this 5-step process. And once you've gone through a work group process, as Mike described, that has sort of all different members from your agency or your county that are participating in defining the questions, one of the next step is really to identify, okay, if these are our questions, what data do we need to tap into in order to get information to answer those questions? And can you go to the next slide? And so going back to some of the questions we outlined earlier, those were essentially models for the idea that data kind of fall into these 3 buckets. In the criminal justice system, at least, we're thinking about what are the characteristics of our population, and that often means the demographic, criminal history, and risk and needs characteristics. And then what are the types of interventions that individuals are receiving? And when we say interventions, we can be thinking of, we're commonly thinking of programs and services, but also you can think about the type of sentence, the length of the sentence, the kinds of sanctions, or even the rewards that are used to try to mitigate behavior. And then ultimately, what are the outcomes of interest? And we largely focus on recidivism outcomes, but additional reentry outcomes may also be important. And the key thing to think about here is that all of these characteristics, they are recorded within different data systems. And so sometimes we need to tap into multiple systems to bring this kind of information together. So when we think about, where is data located? And we have these questions that are driving us, and then we're thinking, okay, where do we need to go for that information? This is sort of a diagram of where we commonly are looking for information. It certainly doesn't mean to exclude any sources or data domains that aren't included, but the common domains that we're looking to within the county are often the sheriff or jail data, probation, courts or DAs, which often hold quite similar information. And so if we can tap into one or the other, we can often get a lot of the information we need. And then also often within the county, data from program providers. And this is a big category of many different potential data sources. So as we said before, it could be other agencies, it could be community-based providers, it could be even things that are paid for by the state, and therefore we might be able to get that data from the state. So a lot of things can fall into that domain of data. And then lastly, data from CDCR giving us information about populations that have been in prison, and data from DOJ really giving us that statewide criminal history and statewide recidivism outcomes, which is very hard to access from a county, from the position of being in a county. And the way that we bring these data sources together and we start to map those characteristics, interventions, and outcomes is to use individual identifiers, to use that information that appears in different systems that helps us to bring everything back to the individual. And this is really helpful because we're thinking about people as they move through many systems, and the outcomes are really not individuals within an agency, but the outcomes are really for the individual. And so the more we can see of what they experience, the better we're able to understand what improves their outcomes. Next slide. And you can click through this a bit, Ryan. And so what we're doing here is we're just trying to outline a few sample questions and then talk through what are the data domains that you would go to answer questions like these. And in a few minutes, what are the data elements that you'd want to extract from those systems? So this is just an example. These questions are not meant to be a priority, but just to kind of show you how this would all fit together. And so the questions we landed on to talk to you about today are these three. So what % of probationers are booked into jail within 1 year of release? This is something you might want to answer from the probation department perspective. And it may be helpful to bring in jail data in order to answer that question. Second, what are the most common booking types for those individuals that are booked into jail? So what are they being booked for? And that's a question that's interesting, I think, both to probation and to the jail system. And then lastly, how much jail space are those individuals who are under probation supervision when they enter? How much space are they occupying? And this is probably a question that's most interesting to the jail system. And so we think about, in order to answer these questions, we really have to think about tapping into both probation and jail data. And so those are the two corresponding domains. You can click through, Ryan. So we have to think about kind of linking data from jail and probation. And so just to give you an example of that and come back to that technical violations questions I think Richard had, I'm going to turn it over to Kevin.
Thanks, Mia. And I think when we're kind of looking at probation violations as kind of one of these domains is that, there's some really kind of important questions here that kind of span a lot of just like really challenging definitional questions that I think, the field, California in particular, has struggled with over the course of the last 10 years, especially about what does recidivism really mean? And I think Richard's question is really apt, is that there's all these kind of different ways that, not just a new crime, but also other ways people can end up, back in jail again or going through the court process again. And so one of the ways you can kind of look at this and link data is not just to say, what does recidivism look like? What's that new crime rate? But also, what are the kind of ways that people are coming back into contact with the jail system, maybe not through a new crime, but through some other kind of violation of probation? So when you look at terms and conditions, they're pretty extensive. And I think when you look at how those practices work and the way that probation has largely tried to evolve things like graduated sanctions and rewards and really kind of rethink the response to maybe non-compliant behavior, what are the ways that impacts, one, the jail system and the probation success part, but also then how do we kind of dig a little deeper to know what else could we do? What exactly are we talking about when we say a technical violation? Because too often I think it kind of gets lumped together with a lot of things. And really there's a lot of different types of things that someone can say violate the terms and conditions of their release or their probation and end up, and then jail ends up being a consequence of that. But we do find in some places we've seen there's some definite themes there, and definitely some steps a county can take to actually work together. It's more like a team to really kind of address it or think more programmatically and kind of person-centered about it using that data. So you can go up a slide. So the example here is from a county where they actually looked at what the reason for the actual term and condition of violation was, and actually had booking numbers attached to those people that actually went back to jail again. And so the things that I would kind of note here is that, one, people can violate multiple terms of supervision. It's not just going to be one reason. Maybe there's a dominant reason, but usually they could have multiple. But the reason that came up the most in this this kind of like sampling that we did of violations over the course of a year was that there was some subset there that actually were for basically not to violate any laws, which generally ends up being charges that weren't filed on, but maybe that were still kind of like in possession of drugs or contraband or something like that, where there is kind of like maybe there was no court prosecution side to it, but it was a violation of probation. So, it's a violation of no new law. Residential drug treatment failures end up being a big driver of technical violations, or can be, when no new crime is committed. So someone who actually doesn't stay in their placement or treatment, of their court mandated treatment, that can be a reason for violation. But by far, I think really what drove a lot, at least in this county's kind of violations, were actually things like probation, the probationer not telling the probation officer that they'd moved or they changed addresses, or that they failed to report to probation or had a warrant filed. So end up kind of these things where people are kind of dropping off from that really solid contact with probation that can drive a lot of these violations. And I think that it's important here because all four of these different reasons have different responses and different possible programmatic responses. And so when we looked at this, we saw over the course of the year, all the violation and petitions, this generated about 15% of this county's jail average daily population. So it's a significant chunk that were related to not necessarily new crimes, but really non-compliance, not really engaging with probation, or again, things like going on a warrant and not being able to be found, but end up back in jail again with a significant length of stay of almost 26 days. And so this is different and kind of far and beyond actually things like new crime. This is all things that are really, again, those violations of supervision. And so what this discussion led to is actually about, well, what else could we do to keep people engaged with probation? If we know that one of our people is actually, we haven't seen them for a few days, they're at risk of going to warrant and having a warrant filed with the court, what other kind of providers, community members, behavioral health, homeless outreach, how can we actually reach out and make sure we maybe see if we can still find this person? Because if they've forgotten their court date, maybe they're having behavioral health challenges and really aren't kind of connecting the dots of what they have to do to stay in compliance with probation, this can then lead to further justice involvement. And so all these are not meant to say these are not worth kind of addressing in some way, but are there ways to kind of reduce this? Could we say if we could, have 50 or 60 fewer of these kind of petitions or violations, that would have a positive impact on the jail by taking folks out of custody and into maybe a different therapeutic environment or back engaged with probation, and really kind of also strengthen those ties with probation as a way to kind of stay connected and actually have that be a positive influence, a way to get to programming, a way to make sure that they're complying with their court dates, but also making sure they're having a positive impact on their lives. So the upshot here is that by merging jail booking information in the jail side with probation violation information, we're able to kind of get a better sense of what is the impact of technical violations in this county, and then also what would be some cost benefit to actually putting a little more programmatic strength into warrant reduction programs. What else could we do to kind of avoid these warrants? Is there a programmatic way to do it? So you actually could match up an X% reduction in jail ADP with some of these reasons and say, that's because we put this program into place or this practice into place to make sure that people have this extra step maybe before going to a warrant or being booked back into jail for to failure to report. But the idea here is by understanding what's driving your technical violations could then help see how that's touching other systems and really look across systems and also make sure you can collaborate with your other partners, be it the sheriff, police departments, district attorneys, behavioral health, to see if there's better ways to address this behavior and not have to always kind of feel like the 15% of our jail population, there's nothing we can do. How else do you be more creative with it and see the data for what it is and understand there's our options here to do things. But that's just an example. And I think, and I'll kind of touch on Richard's question now. Richard's question was, they mentioned technical violations. Can you explain the process on tracking this data subset to recidivism? Because usually the filing is actually going to be of a new crime, of a specific statute violation, we actually end up being able to see technical violations and revocations because those come through a different court calendar. So what we do is usually we layer those if we're trying to look at recidivism, because we would see people coming back through with a new conviction on a revocation or a violation, but we can actually see is layer those and actually see X% is actually for a new criminal complaint, a conviction out to a certain point. But we also have an additional layer there of folks that are actually only coming back for, let's say, technical violations of probation or revocations. And so we actually tend to go with more of the new convictions first, but then we think it's also important information to have about how many of those folks actually also or instead of had a new conviction also had a technical violation of supervision. But I think they can be layered, but I think they say different things about people's engagement with supervision, their success rates. But I think we try and aim more for the new crime convictions as a way to focus, but also make sure but I think it's usually useful information to know who are the people that actually are not being totally successful. And so I think there also is another way to kind of look at this. But the counties we've done, we've really tried to focus on new crimes. So I'm going to stop there with that and go to a Q&A. Ryan, if you can go slide. So I think this is an example of kind of working across counties and kind of across county agencies. I guess I want to kind of open up to the group to kind of ask, what have your kind of successes, what have your kind of efforts been at doing this to really kind of show, how kind of a more of a cross-agency kind of look at people can actually help drive maybe new ideas, new programming, practice changes, system change. What kind of experiences have you all had and kind of where have you found success? What are your challenges? What are the structures you put in place? So if kind of anybody can kind of maybe come off mute and maybe start a discussion here about kind of what are the kind of ways you're trying to use data to inform your local practices.
So this is Andy. I'm with Nevada County, and we've been working with Kevin to merge our jail and behavioral health and probation data. And so we have a monthly internal meeting with the jail captain, behavioral health director, our DA, public defender, our chief of probation, and sometimes his program managers, and some analysts. And what we've been able to do is kind of using the stepping up key questions as a framework, get a better idea of kind of the status of our population, specifically focused on people who are getting booked who have serious mental illness or at least have potential for serious mental illness. So building off that kind of probation presentation he was just showing, we looked at that as well and found that our people who had screened high for potential mental illness were representing a high number of people booked on warrants and probation violations. So we were able to kind of discuss that in our internal group and come up with some solid kind of policy proposals to try and reduce those rates of warrants and violations to try and help that population. So that's been a good experience. We're continuing to, we haven't been able to, we're early on in the implementation process, so we haven't been able to evaluate those changes yet, but it's been a nice way to kind of get everyone to get to a place of agreement on that this is an issue. We can see the data, and then we can move on to what we would do about it. So.
Thank you, Andy. Anyone else who's kind of tried this or tried to tackle these, or successes, challenges, data fatigue, which is a very real thing. You can't look at some point, you can't look at any more charts. You got to actually get to action. Anybody had success with these, or any kind of words of the wise for folks that have tried this kind of work?
Yeah, hi, this is Francisco Paredes, LA County Probation. And I'm hoping that my comment kind of links to this part of it. Down in LA in AB 109, we're working on developing a universal release of information form, which allows all the stakeholders to kind of share not only the client information freely through HIPAA and through CORE and different things, but that to me seems like a huge area for data to be possibly streamed and to be shared between custody, between probation, and different ways to find out more positive outcomes, to take a look at the behavior and to see if our incentives or the programming pieces can flow better to that.
Yeah, I think linking of information is one of those key things, because if it only comes from the agency's point of view of what they have access to, they're kind of missing another side to it. And I think it really helps to have that broader discussion. And I think the release of information is one way. And I think a lot of times, if you have like a county ID or some kind of unique identifier in the county, that can help. But I think just kind of being able to kind of look across systems and having that approach and the release of information just really helps to understand where you're having success, especially if I think oftentimes a lot of these are kind of framed as negative outcomes. But like, where are you actually succeeding? Where are officers like being successful in engaging with people and keeping them on their program and keeping them stable? And I think are there ways to kind of look at that a little bit differently, and that with that release of information, you can get that broader approach or broader perspective on people.
I did also pose a question earlier in the comment section with regards to the exposure that your team has had with case management systems, because we're always looking, especially during COVID. I had a huge question for various chiefs in California saying, how are you guys handling supervision through telephonic? There's the contact between clients is just diminished quite drastically. And so now you have different approaches and strategies and communication styles with clients, and trying to determine the truthfulness and the sincerity and the approach that you have to use to get to those criminogenic needs. But when looking around, there are great case management systems, and I know my bureau chief, Mr. Hiron's on the call, and he's helping to lead the way in discovering that as well, is that there are other systems that kind of like are archaic, and we need to just see upgrades in that area. And you're talking about dashboards and visualizations and different things earlier, and those are key. But I'm just curious to see how what you guys have seen historically, or what, like, oh God, I can't believe they're using this system still, or this style, or just curious.
Yeah. Well, I think that's I think in the last 10 years has been a big move in probation. I think probably it'd also be true of any of our, any kind of justice partner, to really kind of see like, what are the information that operations need? Are there ways to leverage new technology, but also keep it secure and also make sure it's useful for operations? Because I think the thing with a lot of these CMSs, like making sure officers and people operationally and actually kind of custody staff, whoever's kind of using the information, it's easy to input. It doesn't create data quality problems. And then at the end of the day, you can actually get it out. I think those are the big three main factors. And most vendors now, I think of, if you're thinking of vendor side of it, they're kind of thinking of ways to meet all those needs. But I think what oftentimes is lacking though is like, well, what does it actually look like, and help to actually like help with the questions and help to actually get information out. And in my experience, it's not so much like there's no perfect case management system or case management approach. It's probably more, is it flexible, and does it kind of continue to evolve with your system's needs? And I think the ones that seem archaic are the ones that kind of stopped updating a while back and don't take advantage of text messaging technology or other kind of new ways to integrate data with modern kind of, modern data approaches. Those are the ones that seem dated because you have to like literally stick it in a spreadsheet. And I think the other side of the CMS is that I'm betting a lot of people and a lot of who carry caseloads, they've got tons of spreadsheets and all different kinds of tracking because they just can't get their information into a case management system. So that data is living kind of outside of the world, and you've got to kind of know where that is to really do it. And I think that's one of the biggest questions is, where does this data live? Can it be accessed? And does it actually keep up with technology, both operationally as well as for extraction or linking? But I think that's an ongoing challenge. But I think it's modern CMSs, I think, are definitely have 3 or 4 qualities that make them work a little better. But I think it's always an evolving challenge of, not outdated system, but like legacy systems that may have benefits 20 years ago, but now are a little bit hard to upkeep. And then also making sure it evolves with your people and with your clientele.
Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Francisco. We will actually have a slide on this, so you're foreshadowing a little bit.
Okay.
So that's perfect. So we're kind of, we just wanted to pause for a few questions just to make sure everybody is feeling like they're tracking what we're covering so far. And then now we're going to kind of shift back to these steps and just walk through the last 3 steps, and then we'll be wrapping up the seminar for today. So, once you have worked together to identify some key questions you want to answer, you've thought about, well, what are the domains of data that we need to pull from in order to answer those questions? Then the next step is really thinking about, okay, from each of those data sources, what are the key elements that we need to take from the system or extract from the system in order to address these questions? And this is kind of a challenging endeavor because we know data systems have so many data elements in them often. Sometimes they've changed over time. And so we want to find that happy medium between pulling everything out and being overwhelmed, or not getting enough of what we need to answer the question. So to really identify what are those key data elements that we want to pull out. Ryan? And so if we use our sample questions again as a guide, if we're kind of working from these sample questions, we're thinking about, okay, what are the data elements that we need from probation and from the jail system in order to address those questions? And they really fall into 3 categories for probation and 3 categories for jail. We really need to know who these individuals are who are under supervision. What population group they're in under supervision. Are they PRCS? Are they mandatory supervision? Are they the felony probation population, for example? And when did their supervision start? And then also, when did their supervision end, if it ended, so that we can really identify if someone came into jail, are they in fact under supervision? And if they're under supervision, what population group are they in? And for the jail data, similarly, we need to know who these individuals are that are being booked into jail, when they were booked in, what type of booking it was, and what their release date was, so that we're really being able to look at these 2 different types of episodes, probation episodes and jail episodes, and understand where they overlap. Next slide. So what we've done, you'll find these in your materials, we've created a sample probation data codebook and a sample jail data codebook. And these are much more extensive than what you're seeing here, but what these codebooks do is they identify the different types of data elements that we commonly need from these systems. And they give those elements sort of a standardized name, description, and set of values. And of course, what you call these elements in your system is going to vary across every agency and county. But what we've tried to do is to identify a starting place for you to work from in thinking about developing a code book for the data that you have in your system. So what is in that system? And what do you really need in terms of the key data elements you need to pull out? And so what this does is it just shows you a piece of the probation data codebook that's relevant for answering these questions. And so if we go from sort of the conversation on the previous slide about, what kinds of data or information do we need, this slide is just getting a little more technical about that. It's saying, okay, now within your system, though that information can be broken down into a set of variables, and each of these variables is going to have a name that we use to code with, that we use as sort of an identifier. And then it's going to have sort of a description that explains sort of what that variable is in your system. And then ideally, it will have some information about what kinds of values you might see in that data. And so, for example, when we say supervision type, the subtype, that is referring to the supervision population group. And what you're seeing in the values is the different kinds of groups that might be in your data, right? So the different things that you may enter in your system. And so what this table is doing is it's trying to describe the variables that are in your system, what they are, what they're called, and what kind of values you might see when you look at that data, when you extract that data. So it's really mapping out what's in your data system so that you can then identify those key elements that you want to pull out. Can we skip to the jail one now? And so similarly for the jail data codebook, we've outlined the data elements that are represented in that slide that sort of discusses what we need. And what I want to point out here is that you can see that there's a state identifier and a local identifier. And these two pieces of information are extremely helpful when you're trying to link data across agencies. And often the local identifier will be helpful in that. Sometimes you need the state identifier if there's not a consistent local identifier. And then, of course, when you're trying to link data with CDCR or DOJ, that state identifier is really useful. And these two identifiers can help you to clean your data. So to help you to clean your data with an agency, once you've extracted it, you may find there's some errors in your data. You might find that some of the identifiers are incomplete, or that you have some individuals that show up multiple times, but one of the times they show up, their birth date seems to be wrong. So you can go through a cleaning process that's described in a little bit more detail in the codebook materials we're handing out to really get that data out of your agency system and clean it up before you start working with it within your agency, and also before you might start working with it to link it to other systems. Next slide. And so the next step, sort of once you understand what's in your data system, is to move to that phase of figuring out how to extract it. And this is what Francisco was bringing up a few minutes ago. So let's move to the next slide and I'll kind of walk you through some of that. And so there are certainly obstacles to overcome. Kevin, Mike, and I have all had these experiences. In my experience, most of my work has been working on what we called the multi-county study, which was 12 counties and 24 agencies, and helping each of those agencies to extract their data and then to clean it and to standardize it so that we could integrate it across counties and with state data. And these are just some of the challenges that we encountered. Some of these Francisco mentioned. You have legacy data systems. They've been around for a long time. They're not necessarily state of the art and easy to use. There may be few staff that have knowledge of those legacy systems, and the staff that do have knowledge may have pretty big capacity constraints. And then there may be changes in what data are in your system or the quality of that data over time. We know this is an issue with CDCR. We know this is an issue at the county level as well. And so we just want to acknowledge, excuse me. We want to acknowledge that all these challenges really do exist, but also to say, that we have been able to overcome them. We've seen agencies overcoming them, counties overcoming them. We know many of you are doing this work right now. And in our provision of technical assistance in the past, we've really been able to work with counties to ultimately do what needed to be done to get that data out of the system and to get it cleaned so that it can be used. Next slide. And so what this is just an example, some mock data, not real data, of what an extract might look like if we were to pull those variables out of a probation data system. And I'm just going to walk you through this very briefly because we're running out of time. But what you can see is that each of these columns represents one of those variables, one of those data elements that we had in the codebook. And each of the rows in the data represents an observation. And when we think about observations in criminal justice data, we're really thinking about events. So a single individual could appear in the data set many times. They could have many events. And events are things like probation supervision, periods or episodes, jail episodes. They might involve sort of program participation. So there can be all kinds of events in your data. And so what this data set does is it shows sort of a mock example tracking supervision episodes, right? And so what we have in the first column and the second column are those really key individual identifiers, the CII number and the local identifier. That's what's going to help us to track individuals if they have multiple supervision episodes. We also have a supervision number that's similar to a booking number that's going to track that particular supervision spell if there are multiple events during that supervision episode. And so then we have a start date, we have a population type, and we have an end date. And you can see in that last row of data, we don't have any information on an end date. And the presumption is that that spell started recently on October 20th, and it has not yet ended. Next slide. And so similarly, for the jail data, we're showing you just an extract here with some of these values entered in. And you can see in these data, the first two observations, you'll see the same CII and the same local ID. That's telling you that this is the same individual. But then when you look at the booking number, you can see how that's tracking different jail episodes with different booking dates and different release dates and for different reasons. In that last observation, you can see someone coming in on a probation violation, and you can see that they're still held in jail because they haven't yet been released. Next slide. So what we have here are a set of action steps for building that data infrastructure at the agency level. So if this is something that you want to go back and you want to engage in as an agency, or something that you're in the process of engaging in, these are some steps that we've laid out that can move you through that process. And as we said, we're here to provide that technical assistance. When we come back together in 2 months, we're going to be talking about sort of the next stage of that process. And so if these goals are goals that you want to work on and accomplish over that period of time, that's great. You'll be moving right along with the seminar. They may actually be goals that you need, or action steps that you need to take over a longer period of time. And so the way we've laid that out is really starting with that agency level data working group. So pulling from leadership, pulling from operations, from programming, and from research, ideally to form a working group that's going to think about what are the key questions that we need to answer for our population. And then developing a code book, if you don't have one yet, that really just describes the data contained in your system. This is an incredible piece of documentation that can create a sustainable use of your data within your agency over time as staff changes, really detailing what's in that data system. And then as a group, identifying, what are the key elements that you want to extract, and how can you set up a plan to extract those data elements. And then lastly, the last question in this process, once you've sort of got your agency data extracted, is then what more do you need? Is there anything more that you need to answer the key questions you've asked? And in particular, do you need data from other agencies? Next slide. And so that's our last step. Our last step is thinking, okay, if you do need data from other agencies, how do you develop a plan for linking to other agency data? Next slide. And so there are really two key things we want to highlight here from the agency perspective. You want to find a way to clean your data prior to trying to link it. So each agency that's going to participate in data linking wants to go through a cleaning process. And second, you want to align identifiers. So you want to make sure that each agency that's preparing to link is using similar identifiers and is going to clean those identifiers in through a similar process. And that's really going to just set you up for success when you're going forward to try to match individuals together in these different systems. Next slide. And the next thing you need to do is to really figure out the data sharing structure. And there's really two key components to this. The first is, where will the data be linked? So who will be linking the data? Where will it be securely stored? And who will engage in that work to actually do the linking? And there's lots of different options for this. 3 that we want to highlight is you can say, okay, well, one agency in our county is going to take the lead. They're going to receive, they're going to make sure the data is clean, and they're going to link it, and then make it available as needed to other agencies. A second option is that there might be something at the county level, an agency or independent department that would do the data linking for all of the agencies that are providing data. And lastly, you might choose to work with an outside entity such as a university to do that work. Once you decide on the structure, it's really key to think about what your data sharing agreements will look like. And one of the materials we have for you today outlines the key components of a data sharing agreement. So every data sharing agreement is different, but what are the key components that are typically included? And we also have a template for a data sharing agreement that you can look at. Okay, and so we have 2 minutes left. I'm going to quickly move through sort of the building the county level data infrastructure. So just to kind of wrap this up, if you decide to move into that next stage of building that cross county infrastructure, really it's helpful to have that cross county working group that parallels your agency level working group, that you work with together to identify the key shared questions across the group, and then to determine what data will need to be linked to answer those questions. And that group really forms a basis for you to figure out, how you're going to build the infrastructure and what the data sharing agreements will look like. And then finally, extracting, sharing, and linking those data using those common identifiers. So I'm going to turn it over to Ryan now to take any questions and wrap up the seminar for today.
So because we are 1 minute away and I'm sure people have other meetings to get to, I think we're going to just pass on the Q&A, but I want to put it out there that if you have any final questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. All of our emails are available. Well, my email in particular is available at the end of this slide and on the website. And so you can do that. You also have connections with each of Mia, Mike, and Kevin who spoke today. So feel free to email and we'll get you any questions answered and also share anything we have with the group on the seminar series website. Mia talked about it briefly. So we have links to the jail data codebook, probation data codebook, data use agreements guide and example. And then also the series website. Once again, I think before we go, I'll have Kevin drop the data and evaluation series info into the chat. So you have the link to our website, but you can also feel free to email me anytime and we'll put that out. All of the documents today, the recording of this seminar, the attachments are all on that website. So it's a great resource to go to, and that website will be updated as we move through both series with each of the documents that we described. So you can always go back, maybe watch a part of this that you missed, or ultimately engage in the actual attachments that we have here. Let's see, looking ahead, we are at our time, but in January, we're going to be doing our next session seminar on the data and evaluation series. And really that is about accessing and integrating data held by CDCR and DOJ. And so we'll be talking about what a model template looks like that can do that for you, and overcoming some of those hurdles that you may have encountered in the past related to trying to access these external data agencies. Then in December, we have our second seminar coming up for the programming series. This is the second part of the first part of the strategic framework component, which is really about looking at the program inventories that you may have developed in the past or ones that you're currently developing, and then matching those to the available literature about those programs and seeing really if they are truly evidence-based and researched in a way that can be supported as you move forward. And so those are the two series that are going to keep going, and seminars coming up, and I'm happy to answer any questions after this about those. There's also registration links available on our website if you know people or would like people to join in these, so that we will be engaging you. Here's my contact info. This is my mobile phone. Feel free to text me updates about your family life. Just kidding. Feel free to ask me any questions you have. I'm available all the time, so you can reach out to me and we'll connect you to anything that you need in terms of resources. My email is also available there. We're over our time by 2 minutes, but I want to thank you for joining us today. All of the documents that we talked about will be uploaded to the website within the next day or so. They actually should be on the website today for the documents, but the recording will be up in the next 24 to 48 hours. Once again, we are excited to have you. This is amazing, incredible work. Thank you, Mia, so much for going through so expeditiously. I know it's a lot to cover. We appreciate all of your time today. Thank you for the Q&A. I think it was a good, robust conversation, and I know that there's so many questions that come up throughout this process, so we're here to help you and guide you through that as we move through the series. Thanks again, everybody, and have a good day.